The aroma rising from the simmering pot stopped Antonio's trembling hands mid-stir. It smelled like his grandmother's garden, earthy, mysterious, alive with possibility. He hadn't seen this strange herb in 60 years, not since he'd watched Nonna whisper prayers over a village child with the same ghostly pallor that now haunted his granddaughter Sophia. 3 doctors had surrendered to modern medicine's limitations. 4 specialists had shaken their heads in practiced sympathy. Sophia's blood tests showed the same inexplicable pattern that had claimed 5 children in his childhood village. Only now, as the forgotten herb melted into his soup, did Antonio realize his entire culinary career had been preparing him for this moment. Before we start, tell us where you're watching from. This story will stay with you long after it ends. Hit subscribe and be part of something unforgettable. The aroma of simmering tomatoes and basil filled the kitchen of Rossi's, the same way it had for over 40 years. Chef Antonio Rossi, his hands gnarled like ancient olive tree roots, moved through the kitchen with the deliberate grace that had become his signature. At 72, his body had slowed, but his senses remained knife-sharp. "Chef, the delivery from Romano's farm is here," called Chef Lucas, his former apprentice, who now handled most of the day-to-day operations. Antonio nodded without looking up from the pot he was stirring. "Check the tomatoes first. Last week they tried to slip in some greenhouse-grown with the heirlooms." He could tell the difference blindfolded. That was something the young chefs with their fancy degrees couldn't understand. Cooking wasn't just about technique. It was about listening to the ingredients. "Today's the day, Antonio?" said Miguel, the dishwasher who'd worked alongside him for 3 decades. "Final menu planning for your last hurrah." Antonio's weathered face crinkled into a smile. 47 years in this kitchen. Hard to believe it ends next Saturday. The retirement dinner had been planned for months. 400 reservations, food critics flying in from across the country, and a menu that would showcase the journey of his career, from the simple dishes of his childhood in southern Italy to the refined Italian-American cuisine that had earned him 3 stars and countless accolades. As he tasted the tomato base, his mind drifted to the conversation with his daughter Maria that morning. "Dad, we're worried about Sophia," she'd said, dark circles under her eyes. "The doctors ran more tests yesterday. They still don't know what's wrong." His chest tightened thinking about his 8-year-old granddaughter. For 3 weeks she'd been getting weaker, fatigue, loss of appetite, a strange paleness to her usually rosy complexion. "What are they saying now?" he'd asked. "Still nothing conclusive. Not anemia, not leukemia, thank God, but she's not getting better." Maria had rubbed her temples, a gesture so much like her mother, it made Antonio's heart ache. "I've got a colleague at the pharmaceutical lab looking into rare metabolic disorders." Antonio had nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. Maria was a scientist through and through. She trusted labs and tests and medications. She'd rolled her eyes more than once at his belief in the healing power of food, real food, prepared with intention. The sizzle of garlic hitting hot oil pulled him back to the present. Lucas was preparing the base for tomorrow's special. "Not too hot," Antonio cautioned. "You'll burn the garlic." Lucas adjusted the flame with a barely concealed sigh. He was a good chef but impatient, like most young people today. Antonio wiped his hands on his apron and moved to his small office off the kitchen. The walls were covered with framed reviews, awards and photographs spanning nearly 5 decades. He pulled down a worn leather-bound book from the shelf, his grandmother's recipe collection, handwritten in a mix of Italian dialects and broken English. For his final dinner, he decided his signature dish would be Nonna's minestrone della vita, the soup his grandmother had made for every important family occasion. The soup of life, she'd called it. Antonio flipped through the yellowed pages, past recipes for wedding bread and christening pastries, until he found the soup. The list of ingredients was familiar. He'd made it hundreds of times, but something nagged at him. Something was missing. His cell phone rang. Maria's number. "Dad, can you come by the house tonight? Sophia's been asking for you, says she wants your soup." Antonio felt something stir inside him. "Which soup?" "I don't know, Dad. She just said, Nonna's special soup, the one that makes everything better. I told her you're busy with retirement planning, but..." "I'll be there at 6, he said, cutting her off, "and I'll bring the soup." After hanging up, Antonio sat for a long moment, staring at the recipe. Sophia had never specifically asked for his minestrone before. Children usually preferred simpler flavors, yet somehow she knew to ask for it now, when she was ill. That afternoon he prepared the soup with meticulous care, selecting each ingredient personally. Before leaving the restaurant, Antonio stepped into the small herb garden behind the kitchen. This patch of earth, no larger than a parking space, had been his insistence when they'd renovated 15 years ago. He knelt carefully, his knees protesting, and began to gather what he needed: fragrant basil, sharp rosemary, delicate thyme. As he reached for a sprig of oregano, his eye caught something unusual growing in the corner of the garden, a plant he hadn't noticed before, with distinctive serrated leaves stretching upward like tiny hands reaching for sunlight. "What are you doing here?" he murmured, touching the leaves gently. Memory stirred, his grandmother's garden in Calabria, over 60 years ago. The same plant growing wild along the stone wall. Nonna carefully cutting leaves, murmuring something about only when needed. Antonio couldn't remember its name, but his hands remembered its purpose. He carefully cut several leaves and wrapped them in a damp cloth. Maria's house was only a 10-minute drive from his apartment. The soup, carefully sealed in his best container, filled the car with its aromatic promise. The mysterious herb remained unused, tucked safely in his pocket. "Thank God you're here," Maria said when she opened the door, looking more exhausted than she had that morning. Her fever's up again, and she won't eat anything. Antonio followed his daughter upstairs to Sophia's bedroom. The sight of his granddaughter, usually so vibrant and chatty, lying pale against her pillows, made his chest tighten. "No." Her face brightened slightly. "You brought your magic soup?" Antonio sat carefully on the edge of her bed. "I did, Piccola, but who told you it was magic?" Sophia's forehead wrinkled. "Nobody. I just remembered it made me feel better last time I was sick." Antonio helped Sophia sit up, noting how much effort it took her. He watched with concern as she took her first careful spoonful. "It's good, Nonno," Sophia said after a few bites, "but different than I remember." Antonio tilted his head. "Different how, cara mia?" Sophia considered this with the seriousness only children can give to flavor. "It's missing something, something green and sharp." Antonio's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where he'd placed the mysterious herb leaves. How could she possibly know? As he left Maria's house that evening, a strange certainty grew within him. The plant he'd found, the missing element in his grandmother's recipe, and Sophia's illness, they were connected somehow. He needed to understand how. Back in his apartment, Antonio spread his grandmother's notebooks across his kitchen table. If that plant was what he suspected, if it was truly part of the original recipe, he needed to know why it had been removed, and what it might do for Sophia. Morning light streamed through the blinds of Antonio's apartment as he hunched over his grandmother's notebooks, eyes red from a night of minimal sleep. Coffee cups crowded the table. 4, maybe 5. He'd lost count. The ancient recipe books lay open, their pages yellowed and brittle, covered in Nonna Rossi's flowing script. After leaving Sophia last night, he'd been unable to shake the feeling that the mysterious plant and his granddaughter's illness were somehow linked. The way she'd described the missing flavor, something green and sharp, had sent chills down his spine. His phone rang, startling him. Maria's name flashed on the screen. "Dad, we're at the hospital." Her voice trembled slightly. "Sophia's fever spiked during the night. They've admitted her for observation." Antonio's heart dropped. "Which hospital?" "St. Michael, sir. They're running more tests, the doctor says." Her voice broke briefly. "They still don't know what's causing this." "I'm on my way," Antonio said, already reaching for his coat. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and despair. Antonio had always hated hospitals, ever since losing his wife to cancer 15 years ago. Modern medicine with all its machines and chemicals had failed. "Eliza," he pushed the thought away as he approached Sophia's room. The sight of his granddaughter, hooked up to monitors and IVs, made his chest tighten. Her skin looked nearly translucent against the stark white sheets. Maria sat beside her, typing frantically on her laptop. "Research," she explained without looking up. "I'm checking for rare conditions that might match her symptoms. My colleagues at the lab are reviewing the latest test results." Dr. Reynolds entered, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression. Antonio had met her before, during earlier visits. "Mr. Rossi," she acknowledged him before turning to Maria. "The latest blood work shows continued abnormalities, but nothing that points to a specific diagnosis. We're consulting with specialists at Mayo Clinic." "There must be something you can do," Maria insisted, her scientist's mind refusing to accept the uncertainty. Antonio stood by the window, feeling helpless. Outside, spring had painted the hospital garden in vibrant greens, so contrary to the sterility of the room. His gaze lingered on an herb garden maintained by the hospital's nutritional department. The sight sparked something in his memory. "Doctor," he said suddenly, "has anyone considered food as a factor?" Dr. Reynolds turned to him. "We've ruled out common allergies and food poisoning. Her symptoms don't align with those conditions." "Not allergies," Antonio clarified. "The opposite. Something missing, perhaps. In the old country, certain illnesses came from lacking specific foods." Maria sighed impatiently. "Dad, this isn't like your childhood in post-war Italy. Sophia eats a balanced diet. This is something else." The doctor's expression, however, showed more consideration. "Actually, nutritional deficiencies can present in unusual ways. What specifically are you thinking, Mr. Rossi?" Before Antonio could answer, his phone buzzed with a message from Chef Lucas. "Where are you? Retirement menu meeting in 30 minutes. The food critic from the Tribune is already here." Antonio had completely forgotten. The final tasting for his retirement dinner was scheduled for today, a crucial event in the restaurant's preparations. "I have to go," he told Maria reluctantly. "The retirement dinner planning?" Maria nodded distractedly, her focus on her daughter. "Go, we'll call, if anything changes." The drive to Rossi's was a blur of worry and fractured memories. His grandmother's soup, the mysterious herb, Sophia's illness. They swirled in his mind like ingredients not yet brought to harmony. At the restaurant, chaos awaited. Chef Lucas paced near the entrance. "Finally, the Tribune critic has been waiting for 20 minutes, Lucas hissed. "Everyone's in the private dining room. The investors, the publishers, the PR team." "I'm sorry," Antonio said, his mind still half at the hospital. "My granddaughter's condition has worsened." Lucas's expression softened momentarily before urgency returned. "I'm sorry to hear that, but this retirement dinner is your legacy, Chef. You've worked 47 years for this moment." Antonio nodded, knowing Lucas was right. The dinner would cement his place in culinary history. He allowed himself to be led to the private dining room, where 8 people sat around a table covered with sample menu cards and wine pairings. "Chef Rossi, at last." Frederick Palmer from the Tribune rose to greet him. "We were beginning to think you'd retired early." Antonio forced a smile and apologies as he took his seat. For the next hour, he went through the motions, approving this, suggesting changes to that. His body was present, but his mind kept returning to Sophia's pale face, to the mysterious herb now sitting in a glass of water on his apartment windowsill. "And for the signature dish, I'm assuming the minestrone della vita," Lucas prompted when they reached the soup course. "Yes," Antonio said absently, "but I'm reconsidering the recipe." The PR director looked up sharply. "Reconsidering? Chef, that soup has been written about in food magazines for decades. People are flying in specifically for your grandmother's famous recipe." "Something's missing from it," Antonio said, his voice firmer now. "I've been making it wrong all these years." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Lucas laughed nervously. "Chef is joking. Of course, the soup will be perfect, as always." The meeting concluded with details about media coverage and VIP guests. Antonio signed the necessary papers, his signature as automatic as his breathing. Afterwards, he retreated to his office, closing the door before pulling out his grandmother's notebooks again. This time, he focused on entries from the 1930s, before the family had emigrated to America. Halfway through the third notebook, he found it, a sketched image of the plant he'd discovered yesterday, labeled Herba della Luna, moon herb. The accompanying notes described its use in treating mysterious childhood weaknesses that steal color and strength. Antonio's hands trembled as he read further. His grandmother had written that the herb must be used sparingly and only in combination with other specific ingredients, a perfect balance that had been lost when the family moved to America, where the plant didn't grow naturally. His phone rang again. "Maria." "Dad." Her voice sounded different, controlled in a way that signaled bad news. Dr. Reynolds just told us they're transferring Sophia to Children's Hospital downtown. Their pediatric specialists want to run more advanced tests. What are they saying now? Antonio asked, dread pooling in his stomach. They mentioned rare blood disorders, possible autoimmune conditions. Maria's scientific composure cracked slightly. Dad, I'm scared. Modern medicine is supposed to have answers for everything, but they just keep ruling things out without figuring anything out. After hanging up, Antonio sat motionless, staring at his grandmother's drawing of the herb. A desperate idea was forming in his mind, one that would require him to choose between his professional legacy and a folk remedy that might be nothing more than superstition. The choice, he realized, wasn't really a choice at all. Antonio stood in the hospital garden, hands deep in his pockets, watching Sophia through the third-floor window of Children's Hospital. Even from this distance, he could see how much weight she'd lost in the week since her transfer. The medical team had expanded to include 3 specialists, yet answers remained elusive. Inside his pocket, his fingers rolled the small glass vial containing the mysterious herb leaves. He'd been experimenting in his home kitchen for days, trying different preparations of the Erba della Luna, reading and rereading his grandmother's notes. The old recipe books had revealed more with each careful examination, mentions of the herb being used during a mysterious illness that had swept through his grandmother's village in 1923. Mr. Rossi. Antonio turned to find Dr. Reynolds approaching, clipboard in hand, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been working around the clock. Doctor, any news? She gestured to a bench nearby. As they sat, she spoke with careful precision. We've eliminated 97 possible diagnoses. The hematology team is now exploring extremely rare blood disorders. Some so rare, they've only been documented a handful of times. And while you search, she gets weaker, Antonio said, not as an accusation but as a simple, painful truth. Dr. Reynolds nodded, her professional composure slipping briefly. I've never seen anything quite like this. Her body is struggling against something we can't identify. She hesitated before adding, Mr. Rossi, you mentioned traditional remedies before. I'm not usually one to explore alternatives, but at this point, Antonio straightened. You want to know about my grandmother's soup? I want to know about anything that might help, she corrected. Maria mentioned you've been researching old family treatments. Antonio carefully pulled out his grandmother's notebook, open to the page about the Erba della Luna. This plant appeared in our restaurant's garden. I believe it's what made my grandmother's soup effective against certain illnesses. Dr. Reynolds studied the drawing and notes. This resembles something in the mint family, but I'm not familiar with its medicinal properties. Have you identified it scientifically? Not yet, but I've been experimenting with preparations. Antonio paused, weighing his next words carefully. In my grandmother's village, children once suffered from symptoms similar to Sophia's. Her notes suggest this herb, prepared properly in the soup, was the only effective treatment. Mr. Rossi, I understand your desire to help, but introducing an unidentified substance into Sophia's treatment could be dangerous. More dangerous than watching her fade away while we wait for answers. The words came out sharper than he intended. Their conversation was interrupted by Antonio's phone buzzing insistently. Chef Lucas again. The third call today. Antonio silenced it without answering. Your restaurant keeps calling, Dr. Reynolds observed. The retirement dinner is this weekend, isn't it? I read about it in the Tribune's food section. Antonio nodded absently. Saturday night, 47 years of cooking, hundreds of dishes, all culminating in one final menu. That's quite an achievement. It was supposed to be. Antonio stared at the notebook in his hands. But what good is culinary acclaim if I can't use what I know to help my own granddaughter? The doctor's pager beeped. She checked it and stood quickly. I need to get back. Mr. Rossi, if you want to try traditional remedies, we should discuss it with the full medical team. Bring your research tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Sophia's room. Antonio watched her hurry back into the hospital before turning toward the parking lot. Instead of heading home, he drove to Rossi's, where he found the kitchen in rehearsal mode for Saturday's dinner. Chef, finally. Lucas rushed over, wiping his hands on his apron. We've been trying to reach you all day. We need decisions on the final plating for the minestrone and wine pairings for the third course. Antonio looked around the kitchen, at the young chefs meticulously preparing elements of his legacy menu, at the gleaming copper pots imported from Italy, at the wall of awards and accolades. All of it suddenly seemed hollow. "The soup isn't right," he said firmly. Lucas blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? We're using your exact recipe." "No, you're using the recipe I've been using for decades, but it's incomplete." Antonio moved to the stove where a pot of the minestrone simmered. He lifted the lid, inhaling deeply. "It's missing something essential. Chef, with all due respect, this soup has won awards. Food and Wine called it the definitive Italian minestrone. We can't change it 3 days before your retirement dinner." Antonio ignored him, moving to his office. He returned with his grandmother's notebook and the small vial of Erba della Luna. "I need the kitchen to myself for 2 hours. 2 hours. But we're behind schedule on prep for—" "2 hours," Antonio repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the owner, his authority was absolute, even with retirement looming. Lucas reluctantly cleared the kitchen, ushering protesting staff members out. When the door finally swung shut, Antonio stood alone in the space that had been his second home for nearly half a century. He laid his grandmother's notebook on the counter and began gathering ingredients, not just those for the standard minestrone, but additions mentioned in the older version of the recipe. Lentils soaked in spring water, bay leaves dried in darkness, garlic cloves crushed with the side of a wooden spoon rather than a metal blade. As he worked, memories surfaced, his grandmother's hands guiding his as a child, showing him how to listen to the ingredients, how food prepared with intention carried power beyond nutrition. The mysterious herb was the final addition, just 3 leaves finely chopped and added during the last 5 minutes of simmering. The aroma that rose from the pot was unlike anything he'd created before, earthy and complex with an elusive fragrance that seemed to clear his mind. Antonio carefully filled a container with the experimental batch, then began another pot of the traditional recipe for the restaurant. Lucas and the staff returned to find him working quietly, all signs of the special batch and his grandmother's notebook gone. "Everything okay, chef?" Lucas asked cautiously. "Fine," Antonio replied, focusing on the dinner preparation while his mind remained fixed on the container, now tucked safely in his bag. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., he would make his case to the medical team, offering the one thing modern medicine had failed to provide: hope. As he left the restaurant that evening, his phone rang. "Maria." "Dad." Her voice was tight, controlled. "Sophia's numbers are dropping. They're talking about more aggressive treatments." Antonio clutched the container tighter. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow. Tell her to hold on. Her Nonna has something special for her." Antonio arrived at Children's Hospital at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the meeting with Sophia's medical team. The thermal container holding the soup was still warm against his chest, tucked carefully inside his jacket. In his other hand, he carried a folder containing photocopies of his grandmother's recipes, notes, and the research he'd compiled on the mysterious herb. Outside Sophia's room, he paused to steady himself. Through the window, he could see Maria slumped in a chair beside the bed, holding her daughter's thin hand. Sophia appeared to be sleeping, her face nearly as white as the hospital pillowcase, dark circles beneath her eyes, making her look like a faded photograph of herself. Antonio entered quietly, and Maria looked up, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Dad," she whispered, rising to embrace him. "I didn't expect you so early." "How is she?" Antonio asked, his eyes fixed on his granddaughter. "Worse, her blood counts dropped again overnight. They're talking about bone marrow tests now." Maria's scientific composure had given way to the raw fear of a mother watching her child slip away. "The doctors will be here soon for the consultation." Antonio set his container and folder on the small table. "I've brought something." Maria eyed the container. "More soup?" "Not just any soup," Antonio said firmly. "The original recipe, the one that might help her." Maria's expression hardened. "Dad, please. This isn't the time for folk remedies. The doctors are considering experimental treatments from the research hospital. And yet, none of their tests or treatments has helped so far," Antonio replied, not unkindly. "What harm could come from trying something that helped our ancestors through similar illnesses?" Before Maria could respond, Sophia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "No, no." Her voice was barely audible, a ghost of her normally exuberant tone. Antonio moved to her bedside, taking her small hand in his weathered one. "I'm here, Piccola. I brought you something special." "The soup?" she asked, surprising both adults. "I can smell it." Antonio glanced at the sealed container, then back at his granddaughter. The container was completely closed. There was no way she could detect the aroma, yet something in her expression told him she sensed it nonetheless. "Yes, the soup. A special version, the way my Nonna used to make it." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them as Dr. Reynolds entered, followed by two other physicians Antonio hadn't met, a tall woman with steel grey hair and a younger man clutching a tablet. "Mr. Rossi, you're early," Dr. Reynolds said. "This is Dr. Patel from Hematology and Dr. Winters, our immunology specialist." The introductions were barely complete when Lucas burst into the room, his chef's coat rumpled as if he'd slept in it. "Chef, thank God I found you," he panted. "You need to come to the restaurant immediately. There's a disaster with the retirement dinner." Antonio stared at his protégé in disbelief. "Lucas, my granddaughter is seriously ill. Whatever the problem is, you can handle it." Lucas shook his head frantically. "The health inspector showed up for a surprise visit. There's some issue with the permits for the dinner. Something about the number of guests exceeding our capacity. They're threatening to shut us down before your retirement dinner even happens." Dr. Reynolds cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should reschedule our meeting." "No," Antonio said firmly. "This meeting is about Sophia's health. It takes priority." Lucas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Chef, I understand. But this dinner is your legacy. 47 years culminating in one night. Critics and guests are flying in from across the country. We need you there to sort this out." Antonio felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. The retirement dinner represented his life's work, decades of dedication to his craft, of building Rossi's into one of the most respected restaurants in the country. Cancellation would be a public humiliation, a tarnished end to an illustrious career. "How long will this meeting take?" he asked Dr. Reynolds. "We need to discuss Sophia's current condition and treatment options moving forward." "At least an hour," she replied. "And I understand you wanted to present some alternative approaches." Antonio looked at the container of soup, then at his folder of research, and finally at Sophia's pale face. Time seemed to slow as he stood at the crossroads of his two worlds, the culinary legacy he'd spent a lifetime building, and the desperate hope that his grandmother's wisdom might save his granddaughter. "Chef, the inspector is waiting," Lucas pressed. "The PR team and investors are already there. Everyone's counting on you." Maria watched her father, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Dad, go. The restaurant needs you today. We can discuss your research with the doctors another time." But it was Sophia's weak voice that cut through the tension in the room. "Nonna, is that the special soup, the one that's supposed to make me better?" Antonio met his granddaughter's eyes, the same warm brown as his mother's, as his grandmother's, generations of Rosses looking back at him with hope. In that moment, clarity washed over him like a wave. "Lucas," he said quietly, "call Roberto. He was head chef before you joined. He'll know what to do with the health inspector." "Roberto, but he retired years ago, and the dinner will proceed without me if necessary." Antonio removed his phone and handed it to Lucas. "Roberto's number is in my contacts. Tell him it's an emergency." The shock on Lucas's face mirrored Maria's. "You'd miss your own retirement dinner. Chef, this is your crowning achievement, the culmination of your career." Antonio turned to the doctors, who had watched the exchange with professional patience. "I apologize for the interruption. As I was about to explain, I've been researching a traditional remedy that might help Sophia." He opened the folder, spreading his grandmother's notes across the hospital table. "My grandmother was a healer in her village in southern Italy. This plant," he indicated the drawing of Erba della Luna, "was used in combination with specific foods to treat an illness with symptoms remarkably similar to Sophia's." Dr. Winters, the immunologist, leaned forward with interest. "May I see that more closely?" As the doctors examined his research, Antonio opened the container. The rich aroma filled the room instantly, earthy, complex, with an elusive fragrance that seemed to cut through the antiseptic hospital smell. Sophia visibly perked up, her eyes following the container. "I understand your skepticism," Antonio said, as he poured a small amount into a cup. "But in my culture, Food has always been medicine. This recipe was developed during a time when children in my grandmother's village suffered similar symptoms to Sophia's. According to her notes, they recovered after consuming this soup. Dr. Patel, the hematologist, frowned. Mr. Rossi, introducing an unidentified substance into Sophia's treatment regimen, could complicate her condition. Or it could help where conventional treatments have failed, Dr. Reynolds countered thoughtfully. We've exhausted standard protocols without improvement. Antonio held the cup, the choice before him crystallizing: his restaurant career or his granddaughter, the acclaim of critics or the wisdom of generations. In the end, it wasn't a choice at all. The soup contains nothing harmful, he said firmly. Just ingredients carefully balanced the way my grandmother taught me, with one addition that modern recipes have forgotten. He approached Sophia's bedside, cup in hand. Sometimes the old ways remember what the new ways have forgotten. 3 days had passed since Sophia first tasted the complete version of Antonio's grandmother's soup. 3 days of anxious monitoring, of skeptical doctors checking vitals, of Maria's cautious hope battling against her scientific skepticism. 3 days during which Antonio had been conspicuously absent from Rossi's as his retirement dinner, the culmination of 47 years of culinary dedication, approached without him. Antonio sat beside Sophia's hospital bed, watching her color as she slept. Was it his imagination, or had the ghostly pallor receded slightly? The dark smudges beneath her eyes seemed less pronounced, and twice now she had asked for more soup. Small victories that kept him returning to his kitchen each evening to prepare fresh batches with meticulous attention to his grandmother's instructions. Dr. Reynolds entered, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral as it had been since agreeing to let Sophia try the soup. Her latest blood work, she said, handing Antonio a printout covered in numbers and medical terminology he couldn't decipher. What does it mean? He asked, searching the doctor's face for clues. Dr. Reynolds allowed a small smile to break through her professional demeanor. Her counts are stabilizing. Not normal yet, but the downward trend has halted. Whatever's in that soup, it's not hurting her. Maria, who had stepped out to make calls, returned in time to hear this. Really? The markers are improving? Slightly, Dr. Reynolds cautioned. It's too soon to draw definitive conclusions. But yes, there's improvement. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she took the printout, her scientific mind immediately dissecting the data. The erythrocyte levels are almost approaching normal range, and look at these inflammation markers, they're down by almost 20%. Antonio understood little of the medical terminology, but the relieved expressions told him everything he needed to know. He reached for Sophia's hand, noting that it felt warmer than it had in weeks. His phone buzzed, another call from Lucas. Over the past 3 days, the calls had grown increasingly frantic as Saturday approached. Antonio had answered only once, to confirm that he would not be present for the retirement dinner. The decision had been met with disbelief, then anger, then desperate pleas. You should take that, Maria said, noticing his phone. The dinner is tomorrow night, isn't it? Antonio silenced the call. The restaurant will manage without me. Dad, you can't miss your own retirement dinner. It's your legacy. Maria sat beside him, her voice gentler than it had been in weeks. Sophia is stable now. The doctors are monitoring her. You've done what you could. I'm not leaving her, Antonio said simply. Not when the soup seems to be working. Maria studied her father's weathered face. You sacrificed your big moment for her. It wasn't a sacrifice, he corrected. It was a choice, and the easiest one I've ever made. The hospital room door opened again, and Sophia's eyes fluttered open as Dr. Patel and Dr. Winters entered. The hematologist was carrying a tablet, while the immunologist held what appeared to be a botanical reference book. Mr. Rossi, Dr. Winters began, we've been researching the herb you identified in your grandmother's notes. We believe it's a rare subspecies of Mentha requini with compounds not present in common mint varieties. Dr. Patel tapped her tablet. Preliminary analysis of the soup sample you provided shows several bioactive compounds that might explain the improvement in Sophia's condition. One appears to be a natural anti-inflammatory that specifically targets the bone marrow environment. Antonio nodded, unsurprised. My grandmother always said the soup healed from the inside out. We'd like to continue a more rigorous study, Dr. Winters said. This could potentially help other patients with similar conditions. Sophia's voice, stronger than it had been in weeks, interrupted the discussion. "Can I have more soup, Nonna?" All eyes turned to the 8-year-old, whose cheeks now showed a hint of pink. She was sitting up without assistance, something she hadn't been able to do 2 days ago. "Of course, Piccola," Antonio smiled, pouring a fresh cup from the thermal container he'd brought that morning. "Your great-great-grandmother would be very happy to see you enjoying her special recipe." As Sophia sipped the soup, Dr. Reynolds checked her temperature and pulse, nodding with satisfaction. "Her fever is completely gone," she announced, "and her heart rate is normal for the first time in weeks." The atmosphere in the room transformed, hope replacing the desperate anxiety that had prevailed for so long. Even the typically cautious Dr. Patel allowed herself a small smile. "We should continue to monitor closely," she advised. "But if this improvement continues, we might consider reducing some of her medications." Antonio watched his granddaughter with quiet joy. She was still thin, still weaker than she should be, but the spark had returned to her eyes. The spark that reminded him so much of his grandmother. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Roberto, the former head chef he'd called in to help with the retirement dinner crisis. "Everything set for tomorrow. Health inspector issue resolved. Menu finalized. But it won't be the same without you. Reconsider, old friend." Maria read the message over his shoulder. "Dad, go to your dinner. I'll stay with Sophia. You deserve this recognition after all these years." Antonio shook his head. "My place is here." Sophia set down her empty cup. "No, you should go to your party. It's not just a party, Piccola. It's a dinner to celebrate my retirement." "Like a goodbye to your restaurant?" Sophia asked, her understanding surprising the adults. "Something like that, yes." Sophia considered this with the particular gravity children reserve for important matters. "But you're not saying goodbye to cooking, right? You'll still make soup for me?" Antonio laughed softly. "Of course, I'll always cook for you." "Then you should go say goodbye to your restaurant properly," she declared with 8-year-old logic. "Mom and I will be fine for one night." Antonio looked at his granddaughter with wonder. When had she become so wise? Dr. Reynolds closed Sophia's chart. "Mr. Rossi, your granddaughter's condition has stabilized enough that I believe you can attend your dinner without concern. We'll continue the treatment regimen, including your soup." Maria squeezed her father's hand. "She's right, Dad. Sophia and I will be here when you get back. This dinner is for you, for all you've accomplished." Antonio stood at the window, looking out at the hospital garden where herbs grew in neat rows. He thought about the mysterious Erba della Luna that had appeared in his restaurant garden just when needed, about how his grandmother's wisdom had succeeded where modern medicine had struggled, about legacy and what it truly meant. "I'll go," he finally said, "but only for part of the evening, and only if the doctors promise to continue giving Sophia the soup exactly as I've prepared it." Dr. Winters nodded. "We've documented your preparation method precisely, and we'd like to discuss a research partnership when things settle down. This discovery could help many others." As the doctors left, Antonio sat beside Sophia again. "Do you know why my grandmother called it minestrone della vita, soup of life?" Sophia shook her head. "Because she believed true healing came from more than just ingredients. It came from the wisdom of knowing how to combine them, when to use them, and most importantly," he tapped her heart gently, "who you were preparing them for." Do you love the story? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this one got you thinking, wait until you see the next story, click the video on screen, and keep watching.